Hi, thanks for tuning in. So if you're joining me in this video, it's probably because you're interested in the AI engineering takeoff course that I'll be recording on YouTube. So the great news is this is the first of a series of lectures that I'll be putting out there, and we'll be focusing on applied AI, specifically in the LLM space. LLMs have been an important and critical technology, and we've seen tons of innovation in the space over the last couple of years. Now, the theoretical underpinnings of LLMs can be challenging to understand. So in this lecture, I'm going to be lifting the lid on LLMs a little bit and exploring the architecture that made the technology possible. Some of you might know what I'm alluding to already, but I'm talking specifically here about the transformer architecture. Now, transformers can be difficult to understand. A lot of the explanations that exist out there are quite abstract, but what I'm aiming to do in this lecture is concretize that for you. And hopefully by the end of the lecture, you'll be comfortable and confident articulating transformers to somebody else. You'll be able to comprehend some of the other LLM architectures out there that are derivatives of transformers. So things like Llama 2, for example, or even Mistral. You'll be able to understand the purpose of things like encoders and decoders. You'll grasp how attention mechanisms work, and you'll grasp how self-attention enables transformers to pick up intricate details of complex patterns in data. And also you understand why transformers are more efficient and scalable than their predecessor models, the recurrent neural networks. As an aspiring AI engineer, it's really important to understand the foundations, because as you try to solve more and more complex and challenging problems, you want to have a good solid grounding in theory, because it will help you find those solutions that aren't immediately obvious. As with many of my YouTube videos, you will see a link to a technical blog in the description to this video, and that technical blog will cover what I've covered in the YouTube video, but in a little more detail. That will be available to you as soon as it's published. Okay, let's get into the material. Attention is all you need. Now, listen, that isn't a call to action for you to pay attention to what I'm saying, although I do think it's important if you wish to understand how transformers work. That is actually the name of the paper that was released that brought this paradigm shift in artificial intelligence. It fundamentally changed the way that we approach natural language processing. With the Attention is All You Need paper, we saw the invention and the introduction of a new type of neural network or deep neural network architecture, which we call the transformer. For those of you that haven't already seen a transformer, or for those of you that are unfamiliar with transformers, what you see on the left-hand side here is a transformer. This transformer was directly lifted from the Attention is All You Need paper. And it's worth going into a little bit of detail about how it works. So when I talk detail here, I'm just talking about a high level overview, an abstract overview to give you some context. We will later concretize this when we get further into the lecture. So this transformer that was introduced to us in the Attention is All You Need paper, how does it actually work? Well, it has two parts to it. It has an encoder part and a decoder part. But the real innovation here is actually what you see in these boxes, which are the attention mechanisms. These are the mechanisms that allow transformers to pick up intricate and complex patterns in text data, and they lead to the amazing applications that we see today in the likes of Chat-GPT. These attention mechanisms led to the fundamental shift in how we do natural language processing. The predecessor to the transformer was the recurrent neural network. And with the recurrent neural network, what they tried to do was replicate what we're doing with the attention mechanisms, but in a sequential manner. And this made those recurrent neural networks really difficult to train. And it also made them expensive and therefore impractical. So that's why we've seen the acceleration in natural language processing since the invention of the transformer, because these attention operations that we see here, they can be parallelized, and therefore they can be trained on GPUs, and therefore they're practical. So let's look at the transformer timeline since the Attention is All You Need paper was released back in 2017. So as you can see, we had the release of Attention is All You Need, and they proposed the initial transformer architecture. And that's the one I showed you, the one that has the encoder and the decoder part and all of those attention mechanisms distributed throughout it. And that was proposed for language translation. After that, we saw the release of BERT. And if you're not familiar, BERT is a bidirectional encoder representations from transformers. That's what BERT stands for. It's not the Sesame Street character. So BERT provided us with an encoder only model. And what was special about this is that that model could be fine-tuned for downstream tasks. So things like sentiment analysis, for example. In 2019, we saw the release of GPT-2, and GPT-2 was one of the first decoder-only models. And decoder-only models were special because they could be used for text generation. And that's what we see in many of the applications we see today. And I'll get onto that in the next step. What was also interesting about GPT-2 as a decoder-only model is that it was trained in a semi-supervised way. So essentially what they did was scraped tons of text from the internet and trained it in such a way that the model was trained to predict the next word over that large corpora or corpus of text. And then we saw in 2022 something that really surprised a lot of people, and that was the public release of Chat-GPT. And I think for the first time, I know for the first time for me, it seemed like when you talk to these models through ChatGPT, it seemed like you were talking to a human being. It was responding in ways that I had not seen models do before. And it was understanding my requests in ways that I had not seen models do before. I don't know if any of you had used the previous generations of the GPT models, but when you use them, you could quite clearly tell that you were speaking to a model. It was good, and it was able to kind of articulate something back to you, but nowhere near the level of ChatGPT. So essentially, ChatGPT was powered behind the scenes by GPT-3, which is GPT-2 on steroids. It's again a decoder only model trained on large volumes of text. The additional thing here was that ChatGPT was a fine-tuned version of GPT-3 that was tuned specifically on conversational instructions so that you could use it in a chat model as we are so familiar with today. Now, it's worth talking a little bit about what transformers are actually used for. So I've covered some of the applications already going through the timeline, but there are a few more that are out there that you might or might not be familiar with. So transformers are used in a wide variety of applications, and that's part of their brilliance, really. They're so versatile. So you've got text generation and chat, which we've already covered. There is machine translation. So that's translating one language to another. And that was the original attention is all you need paper. We also have sentiment analysis. So that's, things that you might have come across with, when you're operating in a business, for example, and there's some reviews and you want to decide or you want to analyze, if the reviews are negative, positive, etc. So that's sentiment analysis. There's hate speech detection, which is used pretty much across all social media platforms now. Named entity recognition, structuring unstructured data sets. So if you've used OpenAI's function calling, you would have used that attribute. There is text summarization, and also actually there's image recognition. So there is something called a vision transformer that can be used to process images. So the use cases for transformers are so wide and they're versatile. We can see that they're practical. The transformers are pretty much everywhere in natural language processing and understanding applications now. So let's explore in a concrete way how transformers work. So just to give you a bit of understanding, I will be working off the original encoder decoder model, which was proposed in the attention is all you need paper. So I'll be explaining that. Now, as I've already mentioned, there are models that are encoder only and there are models that are decoder only. But if you can understand the original model, the encoder decoder architecture, that should be enough to help you understand those more exotic models. So the ones that are encoder only or decoder only, or the ones that use additional tricks to optimize their performance. So I'm thinking of things like Llama 2 or Mistral. All right. So let's get into the next part where we will start to concretize our understanding of transformers. So let's concretize our understanding of transformer architecture, specifically this encoder decoder architecture that was posed in the Attention is All You Need paper. So I want you to imagine a city, and that city is called Transformer City. Within Transformer City, there is a company called the Transformer Broadcasting Corporation, or short, the TBC. And the job of the TBC is to forecast the weather over Transformer City. And they do this by setting up two towers. So they have one tower to the west of Transformer City, and that's called Encoder Tower, and another tower, which is located in the city center, called Decoder Tower. The weather in Transformer City has a unique property, and that property is that the weather in Transformer City does actually move from west to east. That means that if you can understand and observe weather patterns happening in the west, you should be able to use that to predict patterns that are happening in the east, because the weather in the west will eventually end up impacting the weather in the east. Now, if it's not already obvious to you, what I'm doing here is I'm drawing parallels, first of all, between the encoder and the decoder processing blocks that are in the transformer architecture that I showed. So I've done that by showing you the encoder tower, which sits to the west of the city, and the decoder tower, which is in the center of the city. And also drawing parallels between how transformers process text. So we're usually processing text from left to right, unless, of course, it's Arabic, but let's assume we're talking about English here. We're processing text from left to right. I'm showing you on screen now is a geographical map of Transformer City. So in the city center, we have Decoder Tower, and to the west of the Transformer City, lying there, we have the Encoder Tower. So I previously mentioned that weather patterns in this world move from west to east, meaning that if you can observe what's happening in the west, then you have the ability to predict what will later happen in the east. And that's why I've got that deliberate setup there of the encoder tower lying to the west of the decoder tower, which is in the Transformer City center. Now, you might have seen that cloud kind of weirdly move across from west to east, and that's just to represent to you that that's what's happening. You know, we have weather patterns that are detected there by encoder tower in the west, and later on can be forecasted here in the east. So the flashing red area here shows the effective region of data capture for encoder tower. So what's happening here is I'm trying to represent to you where the encoder tower can effectively record and measure data about the weather. Okay, so that's what the flashing red region here represents. And then the decoder tower, the flashing green region, represents the forecast area for the decoder tower. So when decoder tower generates a forecast, it's supposed to cover the entirety of the Transformer City here, and that's why it's based in the center. So everything is moving from west to east, and hopefully it's clear from the diagrams that I have shown on screen. Now, it's worth getting into a little bit more detail about the encoder tower, and we're going to get into steady more detail, but I want to show you a quick analogy that I've drawn up between the encoder tower and an actual encoder that sits in the transformer architecture that I introduced, right? And this should help to build the understanding. So we're building this up from the ground up slowly, right? So bear with me. Hopefully things will become clearer and the analogies will become more obvious, okay? So let's start off by talking about the transformer architecture. Now, if you've read the Attention is All You Need paper, or if you've come across transformers before, you'll notice that there's this little N by the side of the encoder. There is one by the side of the decoder as well, of course, but let's focus on the encoder for now. So this N actually denotes that that particular part of the architecture has layers to it, and it might not be immediately obvious from looking at the diagram. And this is why I find the tower analogy very useful, because just as the encoder block has layers, a tower has floors. So each floor in the encoder tower is actually analogous to the layers of the encoder in a transformer, okay? So that's what we're alluding to here with these arrows. Each floor represents a layer in the transformer. So there are multiple operations happening across each floor, and we'll get into the details of those operations later. But just have it in your mind for now that each floor in the encoder tower represents a layer in an encoder itself, okay? Now, there is something special about the top floor. So as you know, towers are very tall. The view is amazing from the top of towers if you've ever been to one, right? So what we have at the top of our encoder tower is a bunch of scientists who have a bunch of weather instruments that they can look out into the environment and observe the weather happening and record that, right, at the top of the tower. So those of you that are have worked with data before, data analysts, data scientists, you'll know that this action is actually creating data. We're recording data. We've got input data. And this is analogous to the input data that we put into our transformer. So if we're talking from a natural language processing perspective, the text that goes into the transformer itself is the input data, just as the weather that we're recording from the top of our encoder tower is the input data into that tower. So that operation of weather forecasting can begin. We're observing that data, recording it, and that's being processed within that tower in some way. And the way it's being processed will become more clear as I step through these slides. All right. So hopefully that's clear to you. Data has been recorded from the top of the tower. Each floor in the tower represents a layer in an encoder, right? So an encoder tower has floors. Each floor represents a layer, and the input comes in at the top. So processing comes in from the top and moves downwards. Now, there is another aspect of the top of the tower that I need to mention here, right? So pay close attention to this encoder diagram, because on the next slide, we're just going to focus on this input section here, right? So our encoder tower at the very top has what I call 360 view of everything that's happening. You can see that represented by this radar here. It's got a 360 view around it, right? And, obviously, when we're talking about 360 view, we're talking about position, okay? So we're capturing weather from from all positions that we can. This is analogous to the positional encodings that we have in our transformer, okay? So the job of positional encodings is to allow us to capture the relative positions of words. When we're talking about from a natural language processing perspective, we encode each word in a sentence with a position, so we can capture the relative positions of words to each other. And that's important for allowing us to understand how different words relate to each other, okay? We're doing effectively the same thing with our encoder tower. When we look out from the encoder tower, we can capture positions. Maybe we capture west, northwest, for example, southeast, etc. We're capturing weather patterns in positions, okay? And we can later use these to inform relative patterns, all right? So that's really important to grasp, just as we are creating positional encodings with our tower by that 360 view. The transformers themselves also embed positional encodings, okay? So let's explore how the encoder tower works together with the decoder tower to actually generate that forecast. And we'll go into more detail about the decoder tower later on in the slides, okay? So we've already said that the weather is observed from the top of the tower. And you can see this here. Weather is observed, that information is taken in. It's processed downwards through the tower, and then we deliver some kind of report there at the bottom of the tower, right? So you can see that report is delivered and sent across to the decoder tower. And then there's some processing that happens in the decoder tower, after which we generate a forecast. So it's important to remember that in this case, with the type of architecture that we're discussing, the encoder tower and decoder tower actually work together, just as the encoder and decoder work together in the transformer. Hopefully that's clear, and we're going to get into a bit more detail about how the encoder itself processes that data that we observe. Okay, so let's have a look at the actual operations within the encoder tower itself, right? So we've covered a general view of how the encoder tower works, and we've covered generally how it talks to the decoder tower, but what's actually happening across all of those floors? All right, so recall that every floor in the encoder tower is actually analogous to a layer in a transformer network in an encoder, okay? And we mentioned already the top floor is where we have a team of scientists with recording instruments that look out and record weather data, and they capture that. Once that data is captured, what actually happens is that data is passed down onto the next floor. And that's our first floor where we're actually processing that data in a sense, right? We're trying to understand patterns that might lie within that data itself. Now, this operation, when we're processing that data, we have teams of scientists, okay? Each scientist is led by a senior scientist. Each team of scientists, apologies, is led by a senior scientist. And that's captured here by these tables, right? So we have some data here. It's being delivered, it's being talked about and manipulated, and, you know, it's being processed by some scientists, and that is one team of scientists. And you can see here in this particular example, we have 4 teams of scientists. If it isn't clear already from the diagram, obviously this data capture is happening on the top floor, and then that's being sent down to the floor below where we start our processing with the teams of scientists. Once those scientists have done processing that data, what they do is they'll compile a report, and that report is sent down to the next team of scientists, which is in the floor below. And then they start processing that data. So they take that as an input and they start manipulating that. Now, how does this all relate to transformers, and how does this relate to transformer mechanism? It's really key, but we're going to get into that in the next slide. So here is the process I've described, but we've lined it up against the transformer architecture. So we've lined it up against the encoder architecture to give you a better idea of how this actually works and why it's important. So we're processing on the top floor, and we've sent that down. So that's the inputs. And that's obviously got the positional encodings as well, because we're taking that 360 view. So our scientists have data about the weather and the positions. Now, what we're seeing happening here is actually like the multi-head attention that we see happening within the encoder transformer block itself, okay? So this multi-head attention operation is really it's the magic. This is how we start to pick up all those different complex patterns in data. And this is why transformers have been so effective. So I mentioned that we have teams of scientists, and each team of scientists is led by a senior scientist. So we've got one scientist, and when we talk about multi-head attention, we usually talk about it in terms of something called query, key, and value, okay? So those are the technical terms that you will hear around multi-head attention. And if the key value thing sounds familiar, query, key, value thing sounds familiar, it's kind of, I like to imagine it like, you know, like a dictionary. If you work with Python, there's a key and value, right? And those things are aligned, they're pairs, right? You find the key and there's a value associated with it. So what the senior scientists will do on a given floor, so let's say we've processed the data at the top floor, and now we're on the floor beneath that, where with all of these boffins, these scientists, they're looking at that data, and the senior scientist makes a request about that data to the team of scientists. The senior scientist might say something like, oh, you know, we need to look at pressure, temperature, blah, 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 something. They'll make a request. That request is sent to the team of scientists that they're working with, that they're in charge of. The scientists will have a look, they'll interpret the request, that's the key, and then there will be a value, there'll be a result of them interpreting that request. They might observe some patterns, and then they will consolidate that and produce a report. Now, the thing to pay attention to here, and, you know, again, is not always immediately obvious from the diagram, is that this one team of scientists represents one attention head, right? So that's just one attention head. On each floor of our tower, we have multiple teams of scientists. So that means we have multiple attention heads, and that's where the name multi-head attention comes from. So different teams of scientists might be making different queries and performing different analysis on the same data that they receive from the top floor. So the operation is starting to get quite complex, as you can imagine. We have not just one team of scientists here, but we actually have several teams of scientists. And that makes up our multi-head attention. So for a given floor, once those teams of scientists actually produce their report, so each team of scientists will produce some kind of report. That report is consolidated with the reports from the other teams, and then that is shared with the next floor down. So that report is an actual input to the teams of scientists in the next floor down. All right. So hopefully that is clear what's happening with the attention mechanism. And if I go to the next slide, you can see the report has been received from the team of scientists on the floor above them. And again, we have this multi-head attention operation where one team of scientists is, you can think of as one attention head. They're processing the data. So instead of, this team of scientists isn't processing the raw data that was at the top of the tower. They're processing the derivative data that the previous team of scientists were working on. So they're looking at different patterns. And this time those patterns might actually be more abstract because they've already been pre-processed by a previous team of scientists, okay? So again, that's processed across all our scientists, and then it's consolidated into another report, and that report is sent down to the next floor. And this operation is exactly analogous to how data is processed, or text data would be processed through the transformer network itself, through those layers. So with each layer, there's a different level of processing that happens. All right, so hopefully you should start to get a picture of what's happening across all those floors in the encoder tower. And actually, this leads to quite profound consequences for the data we're processing. And I'd like to just take some time to explain this. So as well as multi-head attention, there's a concept in processing data like this that means that we're picking out really intricate and complex patterns. And this is called self-attention. Now, you recall, right, that the data is coming in from the top of the tower, and we're doing that by taking our 360 observation of the weather. After which that data is recorded and it's passed down sequentially to the floor beneath, where we have our multiple teams of scientists that are looking and interrogating that data, and then eventually creating their own reports, which are then consolidated and then sent down to another team of scientists, right? Now, this process actually happens sequentially. So the passing down of data through floors happens sequentially until we reach the bottom of the tower. And each time data reports are passed down, the output from one floor is the input to another floor. This is really key to understand, because the data that is being interpreted and manipulated by our teams of scientists is not the initial data that we recorded. That only happens once. After that, we're interpreting and manipulating derivatives of that data. So data that has already been manipulated and interpreted by other scientists, and that process happens sequentially. So if you imagine, right, if you were at the top of this tower and you were on the first floor and you were taking that data and sending it, you were in charge of moving it physically to the team of scientists that are going to process it. You could read that data and maybe you'd even understand it. You'd look at it and you go, oh, right, yeah, they've taken some temperature recordings, wind recordings, they've measured pressure in the atmosphere, blah, blah, blah. They've measured things that look familiar to me, right? Then you go to the next floor of scientists, right? And you hand them those data points, and then they manipulate them. And you remember there's multiple teams, there's multiple heads, multiple attention heads. So they're each manipulating that data in their own way, and then they're consolidating it. You take that report and you want to take it down to the next team of scientists. You read it, and maybe you might even understand what's happened, but it's a little more complex this time. Maybe they've put some models in there. Maybe they've built some regression models on top of the data, for example. Maybe there's some linear regression models in there, or logistic regression models, whatever you like. Maybe there's an XGBoost in there. Okay, so it's starting to get a bit more complex. We're capturing more complex relationships. Now, you take that report and repeat the process for the next team of scientists, and the data that is the output of that process might not be entirely obvious to you what it's capturing. In fact, it's so far away from what was initially captured at the top that you might not even understand it. And by the time you get to the bottom of the tower, after repeating that process through all of the floors, the final report is probably going to be way too complex for you to understand. This is what's happening when we are processing data through the layers of a transformer. The representations, that's what we call them, those representations of text are being processed, and the outputs of one layer are feeding into the inputs of another. And the processing is becoming so abstract and so complex that it's hard to understand what's going on. And that's why we refer to these models as black box models. We don't really know what's being captured there. But it's this exact same property that makes it so that these models can actually capture the complex relationships that we need to capture in order to understand language. And you'll know in any type of machine learning or any type of activity like this, there's a trade-off between transparency and model performance or model complexity. More complex models often can capture more complex relationships, but they are less transparent. And that's what we see with transformers. So it's really important. Where the self-attention bit comes in is that every layer or every floor, every team of scientists across every floor is aware of the work that the other scientists have done. And that's because the inputs from one floor, the outputs from one floor are the inputs to another floor. So even if the data is complex, even if the analysis or the manipulation that the scientists have done is complex, it's still derived from work of other scientists before them. So there is an awareness across the entire tower of the work of all of the scientists. So that is what we call self-attention, and that's what allows us to capture the complex relationships in the data. This exact same thing happens when we're processing text. Now, the second thing to be aware of here is there are actually two operations happening here, right? There's the sequential passing of data from floor to floor. And obviously, because the output of one floor is the input of another, you have to wait for the processing to happen on one floor before you can send it to another. But across each floor, so on a single given floor, you have teams of scientists that are working independently to process data. Those operations happen in parallel. And if this is starting to sound familiar to you, then good. This is exactly how we are able to train these models on GPUs, because these attention heads or these teams of scientists can operate in parallel. And that means they can do their data processing at the same time. So that's equivalent to when you want to host a model, for example, on a GPU, and the model is quite large. You can actually have multiple GPUs and you can split that model up aligned with the attention head. So you can have one attention head on one model, another on another model, and you can host that model across multiple GPUs because those attention operations happen in parallel, right? And GPUs are really good at parallel processing. So that's where that comes from. So if you imagine it as a team of scientists that can all operate on the same data independently. So you have two operations. You have one operation happening in series. So that's the passing of data from floor to floor, and another operation happening in parallel, and that is the attention mechanisms or the teams of scientists working on each floor. Right. And then you have self-attention, which is the awareness of what everyone else is doing across the entire tower. And this is what is happening in our encoder when we're looking at transformers. Hopefully that analogy is clear to you. If you need to revisit that, it's all written in the technical blog, and that will be available to you in the description. All right. Hopefully it should be obvious to you now what exactly is the purpose of the encoder tower. Essentially, what we're doing here is we're capturing data from the environment and then processing it in such a way that we capture some really complex and abstract relationships about our weather data, which is then produced as a report at the bottom of the tower. And remember that each floor in the tower is like a layer in a transformer. So there is sequential processing happening between floors, and across floors, we have multi-headed attention, where we have scientists that are working to process that data and identify intricate patterns and complex patterns and relationships in the data itself. Okay, so now how does that actually relate to the decoder tower? So if we have a look at the screen now, what we can see here is going back to that geographic map that we have of the encoder tower here in the west, capturing our data. And then in the east, we have the decoder tower, which is based in this transformer city center. So you can see that report is shared with the decoder tower. And that report could be shared by any way in your imagination. So it might be emailed, somebody might run it over, it might be sent through the mail, whatever you want, it's shared with the decoder tower. The next thing that happens is the decoder tower actually uses that report to generate its regional forecast. All right. You know, this is a high level view of what's happening with the decoder tower. We're going to get into the details of the actual operational processes in the decoder tower. Just to let you know, many of them are actually similar to what's happening in the encoder tower, but there are some twists that we got to be aware of. So it's good to start with this high level perspective. So that report has been shared with the decoder tower, and then they use that information from that report to generate a forecast. Now, the thing to understand about the decoder tower here is that forecasts are actually generated from west to east, right? And remember, I said that the weather patterns in this area move from west to east. So we have some information that's sent over from the encoder tower. That's all the context of the weather over in this region. It's sent across, and the decoder tower uses that and goes, okay, there's some patterns here. We think the weather in the more easterly region is going to be like this. And there's a weather forecast generated there. Now, what's interesting is that weather forecast is then fed back into the decoder tower. And then it's used to generate another forecast, which is slightly more east of the original forecast, right? So the weather forecasting that happens in the decoder tower happens from west to east incrementally and sequentially, okay? And this is analogous to how large language models predict tokens. So you might have seen it in Chat-GPT, where when you ask it a question, when it responds to you word by word. So essentially what's happening is it's using the words that it's already generated as inputs to generate the next words. Okay, so this is what you call auto-regressive generation. This is auto-regression. All right, so it's using its own forecast previously done in a more easterly direction. So you can see that covered here by the red area. That has been fed back into the tower, and that's used as a basis to generate the next forecast. And if I had this all mapped out, you'd see it go all of the way round in that manner. Okay, so that's what the decoder tower does. And let's just put that together. The encoder tower is collecting some data about what's happening in this westerly region of the city, because we know that westerly region, the weather is going to impact the eastern region at some point in time later on, right? Because the weather moves from west to east. So essentially what we're doing is we're capturing like a broader aspect of the weather by using this decoder tower. It's capturing some broader context about the weather. That report is shared, using the encoder tower. That report is shared with the decoder tower, and then an initial forecast is generated, and that's fed back in to the tower. So the tower has an awareness of not only what's happening over here, but it also has some local awareness as well, because it's generated a forecast based on what's happening over here, and that forecast is fed back in, right? And then that's used to generate another forecast that is a bit more east of the initial forecast. So the forecasting from the decoder tower moves from west to east. So another thing that's really important to remember to understand about the decoder tower is that it's not actually observing its data. It's not observing any weather data directly. Everything here that's been generated is a forecast, right? So we are using the data observed by the encoder tower as the context, and also the original, the forecasts that were done in a more easterly direction, in a more westerly direction to forecast what's happening in the east. So forecasts move from west to east. It's not observing any data. It's using the data that has been shared with it by the encoder and using its own forecast to generate more forecasts, all right? So that's how the decoder tower works from a macro perspective, from a high level. Let's look into the actual details of the decoder tower. So let's look at what operations are happening on floor to floor. So similarly to the encoder tower, we have the attention operations happening, right? But instead of just one attention operation, we have two attention operations. So we have one attention operation that deals with the previous forecast, as I said. So there's a previous forecast that feeds in to our attention. So we've got our group of scientists here. They're looking to interpret that previous forecast. And then we've got that group of scientists will send over that report once they've manipulated that previous forecast and, identified patterns there that might be relevant. They'll send over that report to the second group of scientists in the second attention operation. So that second attention operation also receives some input from the encoder tower. So that's where that comes in. All right. Now, just like in the encoder tower, this happens over multiple floors of the decoder tower, starting at the top and then coming down. So these reports are passed sequentially between layers in the decoder tower. And we also benefit from that self-attention mechanism as well. But here, the nuance is that every scientist in the decoder tower is aware of the previous forecasts. So they're aware of what previous forecasts were made. And they're also aware of what information was generated from the encoder tower. So the report from the encoder tower is shared and it's passed sequentially through every scientist, even though every scientist is manipulating it and they're manipulating it combined with the forecasts they've already made in the decoder tower. They're aware of what's happening. So there is self-attention on there as well. So we can see how this mechanism works when we align it with our decoder block in the transformer architecture. All right, so let's align what's happening, the operations that are happening across the decoder tower with the actual decoder architecture from the transformer. All right, so on the right-hand side here, we have the decoder architecture, and then on the left-hand side, we have the operations that are happening within the decoder tower itself. So I mentioned previously, we've got two separate attention operations, and this is where what's happening in the decoder tower does differ slightly, but in important ways from what was happening in the encoder tower. So I mentioned already, forecasts are generated from west to east, and that just matches the weather patterns that we see moving from west to east. So essentially what happens is once the encoder produces its report, it does share it with the decoder tower. We can see that entering the second attention operation here. So what I'm saying is an attention operation is a group of attention heads is one attention operation. So we've got a single attention head. And then we've got multi-attention. So that's that cluster of attention heads. And then that's one attention operation. And that takes as an input the reports from the encoder. And then a forecast is initially generated. So that is propagated down the floors of the decoder tower, right? So we're propagating the output of that attention head down, all the way down to the ground floor, and then a weather forecast is delivered. Now, where the decoder is different is that that forecast is actually fed back in. So that's fed back into the first attention operation, which then processes it with its many scientists as well, just as competent as the other scientists in the encoder tower. They're processing that, and there's multi-head attention there. And then the output of that is fed forward into the second attention operation, and that's processed and downwards through the tower again, okay? So that's what's happening. So as we're working through the decoder, there is an awareness of the previous forecast generated in more westerly directions, and that's sent back through to the first floor, the top floor of the decoder tower, processed by the scientists, and then sent to the second operation. It's combined with the outputs from the encoder tower, and then that's processed downwards through the tower until the forecast is generated at the bottom. And you can see that aligns here with the decoder architecture. All right. So yeah, the decoder is a little more involved. There's a little more happening, but it's essentially the same processes. We have the attention operations. Granted, we have two of these this time instead of just the singular one. Within the attention operations themselves, there are multiple heads. So each attention operation has multiple heads within there, and that's just akin to having multiple groups of scientists working on the same data. One attention operation deals solely with the previous forecasts and manipulates those and sends them to the other. So that's this attention operation. The second attention operation deals with the output from the first attention operation and also the reports from the encoder. So then the output of that attention operation is fed down through the floors of the decoder tower, and there are these two attention operations are propagated throughout the decoder tower until we reach the bottom where the forecast is finally generated, right? And that's what this diagram is attempting to map out here, okay? And that is pretty much it for generating forecasts, and hopefully you can see how that aligns with the architecture. You know, on our left-hand side, we have the encoder, which is there to capture those complex patterns in data that gives us like a broader context. On the right-hand side, the decoder has the broader context available to it, but also its own context, its own forecast that's generated that gives a bit of more of a narrow context or narrow approximation of what's happening. And then you can generate a forecast from that. And yeah, the feedback there is really like what you would see in natural language processing. And that's why when you use some of these generative models, the text is generated like one word at a time. It's autoregressive. So it's using what's already been generated as a basis for generating the next word or the next sentence or whatever. And that makes sure that things are kind of consistent and coherent when they're outputting text to you. Okay. So that's it in terms of encoder and decoder. There is another aspect to it, which is the training aspect. So initially, this encoder and decoder operation that we have, the Transformer Broadcasting Corp's weather forecasting operation, initially it's not very good, right? It's actually quite terrible. The scientists are badly trained. They don't really know what they're doing. So what the executives of the Transformer Broadcasting Corporation decided to do was to actually set up a training program to make sure that the scientists are actually able to spot the patterns in data in the correct way. And the way this happens is pretty straightforward. They collect a lot of historic weather data. So that's collected from the west all the way to the east, and they're collecting this data and organizing it in such a way that it acts as a training exercise. So how does this work? The data is shared with the encoder tower, and it's worked through like it would a normal situation where they would observe it directly, but this time they're just looking at the data itself and working it through trying to identify patterns. It's shared with the decoder tower, and the decoder tower generates its forecast from west to east. Now, the difference here is this isn't obviously a live forecast. This is based on historic data. And the purpose of this is so that they can compare the forecast they generate with what the actual weather was like historically. And from that comparison, there will be some kind of forecasting error. So they might say, oh, you know, we predicted it was going to rain in the northwest, but actually it's sunny. Or sometimes they might even get it right. But this exercise is run over and over again until what they do is they look at the forecasting errors, as I've described, and then there's a feedback mechanism where if they get it wrong, if there's a forecasting error, there are a bunch of executives that are responsible for feeding that back across the towers. So not only the decoder tower, but the encoder tower as well. And all the scientists make small adjustments to ensure that they are predicting the weather more accurately for next time. And then they run that forecast again. This process is iterative. And what they want to see, what the executives want to see, is a reduction in the forecast error. Okay. So they will do that exercise up until the point where the forecast errors are minimal. So they can't reduce the error anymore. And at that point, the executives decide, yes, our scientists are ready. Let's go live with the forecasting. All right. So that is really it in a nutshell. I've attempted to concretize the transformer architecture for you. Hopefully the explanation helped. I know that for me, it's helped me remember how these models work end to end. Now, it's not a perfect conceptualization. There's obviously some things in there that don't align perfectly with the weather forecasting example. But from an engineering perspective, what I hope is that it gives you enough knowledge to understand how transformer architectures work, and also enough knowledge for you to go and then start applying these things and understand why, for example, you can parallelize your transformers. So if you're dealing with a large model, for example, like, I don't know, Llama 70B, and you want to run inference on that model, you understand, okay, well, we're dealing with multiple attention heads. Attention heads are, that operation can be performed in parallel. So I can use some technique to split up those attention heads and operate across multiple GPUs. And then, you can run inference over that. So yeah, that's why it's important to really kind of grasp this stuff, because, you'll run into situations eventually where you want to understand, okay, how do I split across the attention heads? Or you want to understand, do I want an encoder only model? Do I want an encoder decoder model? Do I want a decoder only model? And having this conceptualization hopefully should help you. Let me know in the comments, give me your feedback on this conceptualization. Was it easy to understand? Did it help you digest the transformer architecture a bit better? If you enjoyed this content, I would really appreciate it if you like the video, share, and subscribe to the channel. I'm going to be releasing more lectures for this AI engineering takeoff course. So subscribe to the channel for that if you would like to keep up with the lectures. And thank you for tuning in again. And I look forward to seeing you in the next videos.